Hello, Royals, to the members of the faculty and staff of this great university, students. Thank you for the invitation to share with you today. I'm actually going to be sharing a video from a message that I spoke on the commemoration, the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. The message was entitled, "Out of a Mountain of Despair, a Stone of Hope," which is actually the inscription on the National Memorial for Dr. King in Washington, D.C. As you view and listen to this message, my call to action, my challenge for you is to consider yourselves. Dr. King was a student and a young man when he was seized by history. And I'm just stubborn enough to believe in the midst of the despair that we have, whether it's the pandemic or social unrest, the political climate that faces both our country and our world, that a contribution can still be made by each of us. And you may be saying, well, Dr. King was great, and the person that I compare Dr. King to in this message, Moses, was great, and perhaps their greatness is far beyond what you consider for your own lives. But the truth is, the words that were spoken by the greatest leader in recorded human history, Jesus said these things: "The greatest amongst us will be our servant." So we all have the ability to be great because we all have the opportunity to serve. With that said, out of a mountain of despair, a stone of hope. Tonight is both sobering and hopeful. It's sobering because we do commemorate the passing of Dr. Martin Luther King, which happened 50 years ago tonight. But it's hopeful because he spoke of a hope that was far greater than himself. And when I think about Dr. King, I think about the fact that he literally gave his life to serve others. And oftentimes we create heroes and sheroes out of folks, but in reality, Dr. King was really just a person like you and I, a person that at the age of 15, he had already suffered from so much depression that he actually attempted suicide twice. A person that was trying to figure out how to do God's will, and in his early 20s, took on the mantle of leadership, being a pastor. And so tonight, I want to honor him, to suggest that we are locked in solidarity, the opportunity to carry out that dream. And as I was thinking about what I would talk about tonight, I had to stop and realize that Dr. King was felled by an assassin's bullet 50 years ago tonight, and he was 39 when that happened, and I'm 39. And I thought to myself, what have I done with my life? Dr. King, he lived out the scriptures. When the gospel says, greater love has no man than this, than one that will lay down his life for a friend. And I know that 50 years ago, it was not socially acceptable for me to stand in this space and to share anything with people that don't look like me. And so I'm grateful. In order to really understand what happened 50 years ago and the plight of that, we really have to go back to this journey, literally and metaphorically speaking, that we were just on. We just finished this series called Leaving Egypt, and it was the sojourn of the children of Israel, God's chosen people, led by Moses. Moses telling Pharaoh to let his people go and leading them from slavery and bondage in Egypt towards the promised land, but first going through the wilderness. And Moses found himself in the wilderness on Mount Sinai, and Moses, he was given these tablets, these commands for God's chosen people to continue to go forward. And we often call these commands the 10 Commandments. And there's one thing that I think we probably should pay attention to, particularly tonight. As it relates to reconciliation, the commands that God gave Moses. Those 10 commandments, the first 4 was really about loving, honoring, and respecting God. It was about how we as individuals can be reconciled to God. But then the next 6 was about loving, honoring, respecting, really reconciling ourselves to one another. And so Moses stood there on this mountain called Sinai. And he was there, and the command was given that we have been on this mountain too long. We've got to keep going forward. And so they did. They continued to sojourn towards the promised land, but they ended up stuck in the wilderness. And I can understand what it means to be stuck in the wilderness, because I think if we were to tell the truth, we've all had wilderness experiences, and we've all wondered how long, and we've all been at a place where it seems as though we're stuck. For Moses and the children of Israel, something that should have taken weeks, crossing the Red Sea, going towards Jerusalem, took 40 years. I got a telephone call, and it was that my aunt had passed away. And this is a lady who had raised me, and so I rushed down to Carolina to be with my family and to share in that service and to provide some comforting words as best I could. And then I got back home, and a couple of weeks later, I got another telephone call that my uncle now had passed away, her brother. He had been suffering from depression and had tried to self-medicate, and he was a victim of the opioid crisis that we have in the United States. And suddenly he died. And so I rushed down to Carolina again to be with my family and to try as best I could to provide some words of comfort. And then I got back home. To this day, I still haven't had the opportunity to grieve, to shed a tear for 2 people that raised me. Because as soon as I got back home, I noticed that we'd had some rain and our roof was leaking. And it just seemed like I'm in a wilderness. And so I went down in our basement to try and get some tools to figure things out, and a ladder and all that kind of stuff. And when I went down to the basement was flooded. So I decided I'd go out and just get a breath of fresh air. Have you ever been there where you just needed to take a little bit of a break? You're stuck in a wilderness, but you just need a breath of fresh air. That's where I was. And so I got in the car, and I turned the car on, and I was just going to drive for just a little bit and come back home and try and figure things out. And when I got in the car, I was headed out of the neighborhood, and then the check engine light came on. And it just seems as though when it rains, it pours. And if we were all to tell the truth, I think we could each say that we have seen the lightning flashing, and at some point in our lives, we've heard the thunder roll. We have experienced sin breakers dashing, trying to conquer our souls. But we've heard that prompting. We've heard that voice that says, don't give up, fight on. It is God himself that's our hope, and he promises us that he'll never leave us alone. So everything's fine now, but we often find ourselves stuck in our wilderness. And it reminds me of this preacher who he just lost his entire family to a fire. It's the most devastating thing that could happen. And he was traveling on a road one day, and he stopped because he noticed this beautiful cathedral that he hadn't seen previously, and they were erecting this beautiful cathedral. And so he got out, and he noticed that there was a guy who was chiseling a stone, and he asked the guy, he said, hey, what are you doing with that particular stone? And the person who was working there, he looked up at the pastor, and he said, I'm chiseling this stone down here, but you see way up there on the top of the cathedral, there's a little hole there. That's where this stone is going to go. He told the pastor, he said, I'm chiseling this stone down here so that later on it'll be able to fit up there. And the reality is we all have an up there. We have a promised land that God has promised us, that we are hoping for, that we are believing for. And sometimes we have to go through a wilderness experience, a tough, difficult season, so that God really can just be shaping us and molding us and strengthening us so that we can fit on that next level, that promised land. And so there was Moses leading the children through the wilderness towards the promised land. And Dr. King was in a similar situation. Dr. King decided that he would give his life to the cause of racial equity, racial justice, human rights, what we at the time called civil rights in America. And I just want to give a brief timeline just to catch us all up. It really started in 1954 when Dr. King became pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Young 20-something, now he's the pastor. And there were a couple of catalytic events that really spurred him into being seized by history. The next thing, or the first thing of these three catalytic events was that same year, in 1954, there was this Supreme Court decision called Brown versus Board of Education, where it overturned a previous decision of Plessy versus Ferguson that said, Plessy versus Ferguson, separate could be equal. Minorities in this country and those that were a part of the majority culture actually could have separate facilities, and they could be equal. But Brown versus Board of Education determined that the separate facilities were not equal, and a young Thurgood Marshall, who later became the Supreme Court Justice, led the cause, and that decision of separate but equal was overturned. First catalytic event. Second thing that happened was this 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till, as Dr. King was really trying to figure out how he's going to pastor. He's in this community in Montgomery, but there was a 14-year-old boy from Chicago, Illinois, named Emmett Till, who traveled down to Mississippi to be with his family. And when he was down in Mississippi, he went into a convenience store, and a Caucasian lady said that Emmett whistled at her. So 4 days later, some of the people that lady knew caught up with Emmett Till in Mississippi, and they brutalized him, they drug him, and murdered him. It was so devastating that when his body got back to Chicago, his mother couldn't recognize him and decided to have his casket opened so that the entire world could see what had been done to her son because of the color of his skin. Incidentally, the lady who claimed that Emmett whistled at her recently passed away, and she recanted her story. His image of an open casket, unrecognizable, was plastered on the front pages of many papers, including the Chicago Defender, and that spurred on this movement for civil rights and human rights. That happened August 28th. Use that as a footnote. The third thing that happened was this young seamstress named Rosa, who decided that she would stand up by sitting down. She no longer felt that she should move to the back of a bus just because of the color of her skin. And so that launched the Montgomery Bus Boycott movement. So those three things, Brown versus Board of Education, the death of Emmett Till, and then young Rosa deciding that she would refuse to give up her seat. And so King, now leading the Montgomery Bus Boycott because he's a young pastor in Montgomery, now has to make a decision, what am I going to do? And in April of 1963, Easter, he decides to write some of his white clergy brothers and compelled them to link arm in arm with him to help overcome the systemic injustice and to join this movement. He wrote this letter from a Birmingham jail. Then, in May of that same year, there was this children's crusade in Birmingham, Alabama, where children decided that they would link arms for their own plight as they're going through this wilderness period and they're searching to get to the promised land, but pit bulls were sicked on them and fire hoses were turned on them. Then in August of that year, Dr. King decided, along with many others, that there should be a march in Washington, D.C. for jobs and freedom. And if you don't know anything about Dr. King, you probably know that at some point he had a dream. And his dream that day was really for all of God's children, white people and black and brown people, Jews and Gentiles, men and women, to be able to sit together at the table of brotherhood and laugh together and go to school together and to work together and to go to church together. And for us to live out what Jesus asked us to do, for us to be one. Here's another way to say it. He really was trying to bring about racial reconciliation, racial equity, racial justice. And as I really understand this whole concept of racism, it's based in America on someone's skin and ethnicity, and skin is all a farce. This concept of race, it's not true, it's a farce. Our skin is determined by melanin. The hue of our skin is determined based upon the ultraviolet rays of the sun. And if your ancestors lived thousands of years ago closer to the equator or further away from the tropical regions, that is what determined the color of your skin. And as migration took place, there were people that were in colder climates that moved to warmer climates, and thousands of years later, their skin went from white to dark, and so their ancestors actually looked a little bit more like me. This idea, this concept of being divided because one person is golden brown like me and another person might look a little peach, it's such a farce. But in almost every industrialized nation on earth, people have lost their lives because of race and class. Here's another way to say it. Dr. King, on that particular day, when he spoke about this dream where we would have equity, he really was just trying to say that if you look at an egg, and sometimes we have a white egg and a brown egg, the reality is there is no physiological difference between the two eggs. The white egg and the brown egg, when you crack them open, there's the same thing on the inside. Now, brown and red chickens, they hatch brown eggs, and the white chickens, they hatch the white eggs. And sometimes when we go to the grocer, the brown eggs are a little bit more expensive, but that's only because the brown chickens, they often eat a little bit more because their food tastes a little better. And it's often seasoned a little better, you know, with a little... you guys get the point. And so they pass that cost along to the consumer, but there's no difference on the inside. Here's what Dr. King was really saying, as I understood it. He really was saying that there are three levels of equality versus equity. On this first side, you see that everyone can't see the field. And it's because there's a person that has a little bit more of a privilege than the other person. And so the people that say that we should all have the same box, that's equality. And it seems like it's the right thing. But if at the end of the day, everybody still doesn't have access to the field, that doesn't work for the people that aren't privileged. The second one is justice. And the second one says that the shorter fella, he really should have a few more boxes. But to those that have been privileged to do the second portion, which is justice, that really seems like oppression to the person who had the greater access from the beginning. And so the reality is, what we really want is equity, to remove the barriers so that we all can have access to the field. That's what Dr. King was really trying to promote. And I think sometimes we lose the concept that God wants us to be one. So that's what I believe he was trying to accomplish on that particular day when he said that he had a dream. The good news is, after that, 1963, there was this Voting Rights Act that was passed in 1965. And that protected the rights of citizens, regardless of their skin color, to be able to vote without the discriminatory practices that prevented them from voting. And so there's some good news, because there's more gender equity even as it relates to Congress. About 19% of the congressional seats are held by women. There is some good news, even though there's still a disproportionate amount of Caucasian folks that hold the powerful positions in Congress. Congress is becoming more and more representative of our entire population, so that everyone has access. There is some good news. 55 years after the March on Washington, when Dr. King said that he had a dream, 55 years after, there's access that we didn't previously have. 55 years ago, when the March on Washington took place, black and brown people couldn't go to a public water fountain, couldn't go to a public restroom. They couldn't get accommodations at a public hotel. 55 years ago, when the March on Washington took place, there were a lot of things that just couldn't happen, but there has been some good news, and I'm grateful for progress. I'm really grateful for progress. Today, 91% of Americans support criminal justice reform because we realize that we are living in the most incarcerated nation on earth, and it really should not be. And the majority of people that are incarcerated are black and brown people, far more affected than any other race. But there's still work to do, because 4 in 10 African Americans believe that there may be a promised land of racial equity, harmony, and unity, but it's not one that they will see in their lifetime. There's still work to do, because stats suggest that by the year 2044, the majority of Americans will be what's considered now to be the minority class. And even though the majority of Americans will be minority by 2044, the wealth gap in America is so exaggerated that 10 years later, 2050s, that the median household wealth for African Americans will actually be zero. Here's a chart that shows the trajectory of where it is now. The median household wealth by race and ethnicity, just looking at Latino Americans and African Americans as compared to our white brothers and sisters. There's still work to do. And the trajectory shows that by 2050, the wealth for African Americans will be zero, and a few years later for our Latinx brothers and sisters, it will be zero. There's work to do. And so, if you say, what can I do to link arm in arm with Dr. King and his dream, here are 4 B's that I want to give you. 4 B's. The first is be prayerful. Lament brokenness and ask God for truth, unity, and direction. The second thing is be radical. Stop the segregation in our churches. Work for advocacy in our communities. The third B is to be active. Join Christian groups like Mosaic and others who are working towards justice and equity. The wilderness of inequity is not over. And finally, the final B is to believe. It's okay to believe our brothers and sisters when they describe a different narrative other than the one that we know. And so, Dr. King, 50 years ago yesterday, April 3rd, 1968, he conjured up this image of Moses taking the children of Israel through the wilderness, as Dr. King had been trying to lead all Americans to a promised land of racial harmony, unity, and equity. And Dr. King said similar things to when God allowed Moses to stand on Mount Nebo and realized that he could not actually walk into the promised land, but he allowed him to see the promised land. That's a picture of Nebo, and as you look out over Nebo, you could see Jericho, and you can see Bethlehem and Jerusalem, and you can see Canaan, but he wasn't able to get there. So Dr. King conjured that image. 50 years ago yesterday, these are the words that he said.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the
Lord. Tonight is both sobering and hopeful because the next day, which was 50 years ago this day, on April 4th, 1968, Dr. King was assassinated.
You're broken down and tired of living life on the merry-go-round, and you can't find a fighter, but I see it in you, so we gon' walk it out. Move mountains, we gon' walk it out and move mountains. And I'll rise like the day. I'll rise up, I'll rise unafraid. I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. And I'll rise up, I like the waves. I'll rise up in spite of the
And there are some things that I think that we can learn from both the plight of the children of Israel and Moses and what Dr. King was hoping to accomplish with regards to human justice, equity. The first is that everyone that starts out on the mountain with you won't enter the promised land. And some of you may give your lives so that future generations will have a greater promise for tomorrow. So I encourage you to keep marching, because the Bible is very clear that we walk by faith and not by sight. Second thing is that as we journey from one mountaintop to the next, in order to enter into the promised land, there are going to be some things that are going to have to be birthed out of you. Entire generations were not allowed to enter into the promised land. Only 2 people that started out on the journey from Egypt going towards the promised land, only 2 actually entered into the promised land. But what happened during that wilderness period is that there were some commitments that were made. People got married, people got pregnant, and then they had babies. And so what I'm basically saying is it was what was birthed during that time that was allowed to go into the promised land. And God has promised you certain things. Might feel as though you're stuck in a wilderness, but perhaps God is really trying to birth some things out of us. Because the old us can't go into the place of promise that he has shown us. The third and final thing is that God uses insanely flawed people to climb the highest mountains. Moses was flawed. Dr. King was flawed like us. But I'm grateful that the inscription on Dr. King's memorial in Washington, D.C. says, out of the mountain of despair, there is a stone of hope. That hope isn't Dr. King and it isn't Moses. That hope that he preached about, even though he spoke about a dream, he preached about a hope that's in Jesus. So there is a man that we can trust to walk with us every step of the way. His name is Jesus. He is that stone that we've been talking about that the builders rejected. Jesus is the one who became the head of the corner, the chief cornerstone. It is Jesus that promised on a Galilean mountain, his final talk, that he would never leave us or forsake us, regardless of our wilderness. And I'm grateful, I don't know about you, for Jesus. As I conclude, I have these challenges. I just want to ask, what is your promised land? There are at least 365 unique promises in the Bible, one for every day that the earth rotates on its axis. And one of those promises is that Jesus will never leave us. But what has he placed on your heart? What is your promised land, either physical or metaphysical? First thing, what are you willing to give your life for? Second, the challenge is for you to ask this question. What is God saying that you need to do in order to reach that promised land? What wilderness is in your way? And then the last thing, will you completely trust God? Will you keep marching as the children of Israel did, as Dr. King did? Will you keep marching? Whether it's to overcome the difficulty of Roman soldiers like Jesus did, or the Red Sea injunctions, will you do that? And if you do, you'll understand that true hope that we have in going to an eternal promised land. It's not physical, it's not made with hands, but it's eternal in the heavens. I'd love to pray with you. God, we're grateful for the sacrifices that have been made by Dr. King and others as we commemorate his life, his legacy. The journey that is so often compared to the plight of children that escaped slavery and bondage thousands of years ago. And God, you've given us the opportunity to link arm in arm with our brother and sister and to be in solidarity, to walk through our individual wildernesses and our community wildernesses together, believing that we'll overcome as long as you take our hand and lead us on. And so we pray that you'll do that now. Lead us on. In Jesus' name. Everyone agreed and said?